All right. Welcome everyone to the first workshop of 2022. Today, we're pleased to welcome representatives from HCD's new Housing Accountability Unit. Our speakers today are David Zisser, Assistant Deputy Director of Local Government Relations and Accountability at HCD. David's a familiar face to SCAMF members as he was formerly the Associate Director at Housing California. And he's here to tell us about his new role. We're excited to hear what you had to say, David. Also joining us is Shannon West, the Unit Chief for the Housing Accountability Unit at HCD. And a quick sponsor acknowledgement, bear with me for a second. SCAMF is working with the state of California to spread the word about a new time of use rates. These will help reach the state's energy goals. Rates will increase during peak hours, and for affordable housing providers, your residents may be impacted. Learn more about energy upgrade at california.org. Mr. Zisser, thank you guys so much for joining us today. It looks like we're at 200 attendees and counting, so we look forward to your presentation and to a great dialogue. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alan. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to do a couple our quick introductions and then get into it. I'm David Zisser. As Alan said, I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for Local Government Relations and Accountability at HCD in the Housing Policy Development Division. I have been at HCD all of 2.5 months, so still very much learning the ropes and getting a lot of support and partnership from folks like Shannon, who will introduce herself in a sec. Before coming to HCD, I was, as Alan said, the Associate Director at Housing California for about 3 years. And before that, I was practicing law as a community and civil rights lawyer focused on affordable housing, fair housing, environmental justice, and related issues at Public Advocates for a few years, and at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law out in DC for a few years before that. And I'm really excited to be at HCD. It was a good choice to come here, and I'm enjoying the work and excited to share some of that with you today. Before I turn it over to Shannon just to introduce herself, I want to make sure to give a heartfelt thanks to SCAMF, especially Jeanette and Alan and the whole team for pulling this together. Looks like great attendance. We're happy to have this audience in this discussion. SCAMF is a great partner in this work, and just thank you for giving us the chance to talk with you all today. Shannon, do you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, thank you. I'm Shannon West. I'm the Housing Accountability Unit Chief here at HCD. I've been with the department a little more than 3 years now, and prior to the creation of this unit, I have been working in the Housing Policy Development Division, doing some of the accountability work before it was really formalized. But my experience before HCD includes state economic development. I have been a local planner at a city for about 4 years. And I began my career in the private sector working in architecture and planning firms as an applicant for projects. So the permitting process, I've seen it from many sides, and it's just been a really valuable background to come to the state and work on enforcing housing laws from that perspective. So happy to be here and share with you the work that we're doing. Thanks so much.
Shannon will actually be handling the bulk of the presentation today since she is our expert. I'm going to kick things off though. Just to tell you a little bit about what we'll be covering today. Just a word about kind of the purpose of our work, the housing accountability work. There's actually 2 units that interact with each other a great deal. So that includes some of that work as well. An overview of our accountability and enforcement, or A&E work, who is doing that work, the team doing it, a bit about our various authorities, our legal authorities, old and new, a little bit about our process of providing technical assistance and accountability and enforcement work. We thought a bit of a refresh on housing element law would be useful, so we'll keep that quick, short and sweet, but thought that would be relevant today. And then end with a note about how we think collaboration with stakeholders and partners can look, and hear from you about that as well, and have some discussion and Q&A. That's the plan today. We're going to try to move through it relatively quickly so that we leave plenty of time for that discussion. All right. The purpose of HCD's accountability and enforcement, and as well as our planning grants and incentives work, really there's kind of 4 things we wanted to highlight. One is to ensure that all jurisdictions meet their fair share of the state's housing needs, and that really shows up primarily in our housing element work. Second is to support jurisdictions in promoting housing production through incentives and planning grants. There's a variety of programs that we have, including local and regional planning grants, SB2 incentives, pro-housing designation, all sort of those carrots to encourage jurisdictions to advance housing production. Third is to provide a lot of education and technical assistance to jurisdictions directly to make sure that they understand the law. There's a lot of laws out there. There's new authorities, new laws on the books. And a big part of our job is to help jurisdictions navigate that and make sure that they're following and implementing the law appropriately. And lastly, for jurisdictions that, after receiving technical assistance, continue to struggle to comply with the law, we will hold jurisdictions accountable to follow the law through enforcement actions, and we will talk a bit about that. And that's kind of the focus. Those last 2 bullets are kind of the focus today. Just a bit about an overview of our accountability enforcement work. We sort of think of it in 2 buckets, broadly speaking. One is the complaint-based, or what you could call reactive enforcement, the other being proactive. And we will talk more about both of these, but in a nutshell, we do receive complaints from anybody about potential violations of the various state laws that we enforce. We'll share the email address for that later. And we will investigate those complaints. Second, on the proactive side, and this is something we're really excited to be developing, is really giving housing element law a lot more teeth by allowing us to monitor, track, check in with jurisdictions mid-cycle of their housing element process to hold them accountable to the commitments they've made in their housing element. We'll talk about that later. It's important to note that we always start with technical assistance whenever possible. We look at this work as a partnership with local jurisdictions and with stakeholders, not as something that has to be confrontational. We know there are many jurisdictions out there really trying to do the right thing and promote housing production, and we're here to help them with that. We are a growing team with a lot more capacity, but not endless. So we do find ourselves, needing to think about how to prioritize our work. And, some of the ways we do that is looking at the impact of a particular issue, a development or an ordinance that we've heard about. Will it set precedential value? Will it advance equity? We are thinking along those lines. And then lastly, and this goes back to sort of the TA to enforcement path, we do have a progressive discipline approach that we'll talk about. That's, again, starts with that technical assistance, starts with that collaboration, and moves through to enforcement if necessary. And that can include revoking housing element compliance. It can include a notice of violation from HCD, a referral to the Attorney General's office, which can choose to bring litigation, for example. So who's doing this work? We really think of it as a trifecta of bringing together folks who focus on policy and folks who focus on sort of the legal aspects, and it really blends both of those things. So the Housing Accountability Unit at HCD, where Shannon and I work, is one key piece of that trifecta, and we work really closely with with HCD's Legal Affairs Division, which has a tremendous tremendously talented team of lawyers that we work with literally on a daily basis, as well as the Attorney General's Housing Strike Force, which is newly formed. And we also are in near constant communication with, coordination with, and has a really talented set of folks over there too. So this is, I think, a particularly exciting part of this work is this really strategic collaboration. And I really can't say too much about it. It's been wonderful from the get-go. I think this is where Shannon's gonna kick things off to talk just a synopsis of the various authorities that we have.
Yeah, thank you. Our authority has grown over time. I think housing element law is the basis for most everything that we've been doing historically. And that is beginning with housing element compliance. We review every housing element for every jurisdiction in California. That's 539 jurisdictions, and continue to hold them accountable to the commitments they're making in those housing elements. But in 2017, AB 72 passed, and that is what I think of as the original enforcement bill. And it included our authority to enforce the Housing Accountability Act, density bonus law, no net loss law, and land use discrimination law, in addition to housing element law. But you may not be aware, AB 215 was recently passed, and as of January 1st, so about 18 days ago, we have a new suite of authority, and it includes the Housing Crisis Act, or you might hear it called SB 330, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Law. We finally have authority over streamlined ministerial permit processes, also known as SB 35, by right supportive housing, by right low barrier navigation centers, and limitations on development standards. In addition to those things, our unit is responsible for enforcing ADU law as it relates to local jurisdictions' ADU ordinances, so we'll review those. Surplus Land Act and Affordable Housing Preservation Noticing Law. If you're wondering why some of these are in red on this slide, those are kind of our frequent flyers, the areas that we have spent the most time providing technical assistance or notices of violation on to date. But all of this is within our purview now. Next slide. So again, David mentioned our progressive discipline approach. This flowchart, I acknowledge, is pretty hard to see on a small screen. It is available on our website, but the general idea here is that we receive complaints. This is really a diagram of our complaint-based work, and we'll talk about our proactive work in a minute. But for our complaint-based work, we'll receive complaints. We review each of them as they come in. We're gonna usually talk to the complainant. If it makes sense, we're talking to a jurisdiction to make sure that we're hearing both points of view. Review those against state law, review it perhaps against the jurisdiction's own housing element. When it is appropriate, we'll provide technical assistance. We really like to take a swing at this from the perspective that it is very possible that a city could be making a mistake simply because they don't know the law. The laws are changing all the time, and they're very complex. So we always begin with, I should say most of the time, we begin with technical assistance unless there's a very egregious violation. But moving on from technical assistance, if it's a housing element enforcement case, it moves through a very similar process, except that decertification of the housing element is possible. For all other statutory areas, we would move into a notice of potential violation, perhaps a notice of violation, and if necessary, a referral to the Attorney General. But it's important to note that the Attorney General is the last box on the slide, and it is on purpose. If every case we took resulted in Attorney General action, we would be very inefficient. And I'm proud to say that most of our success actually falls in the technical assistance area. I think our next slide has some stats. So we produced over 250 pieces of technical assistance, and more often than not, we are able to compel some good action, some good outcome through simply providing technical assistance. Sometimes it's phone calls, often it's letters. All of our letters are posted on our website. We make sure that there's transparency in the correspondence that we issue. But we've helped multiple projects get through the planning process into production. We are setting up housing elements to have better outcomes. Our housing element review team understands that on the downside or the backside of housing element review is the Housing Accountability Unit to hold jurisdictions accountable. It means that during the housing element review process, we need to make sure that those programs have some teeth, that they make some actual commitments that we can hold the jurisdictions accountable to. But we are always providing education and help to local governments. We are building our relationships and connections with the Attorney General's office. And by the way, we won our first case with Huntington Beach. Next slide. So again, really quickly over housing element law. There are 539 jurisdictions in California. HCD is responsible for reviewing every single one of those housing elements. So housing element law really enables the state to have influence over housing supply and affordability. Housing elements lay the foundation for other HCD activities, including planning grants. David talked about incentives programs. Some of those programs cannot be accessed without a compliant housing element. Similarly, the pro-housing designation cannot be accessed without a compliant housing element. And our accountability and enforcement work will always touch back to housing elements and the commitments in a housing element. Even if it's a project, we're gonna look at a housing element to make sure that there isn't some other part of their housing element that could have been implemented better through city's actions on that particular project. Remember, most housing elements are on an 8-year cycle. 521 jurisdictions are doing it every 8 years. There are 18 jurisdictions that are doing it every 5 years. And on the next slide, I'll show you what that kind of looks like. Thankfully, they're not all due at the same time. They are on a rolling cycle, but there are 2 significant peaks, and we are really in one of them right now. So in 2021, San Diego, Sacramento, and Southern California jurisdictions all came due in the year 2021. So some of those jurisdictions are still working on getting compliance, and we still have elements under review. 256 jurisdictions, in fact, came due in 2021. So it's been a really taxing time on HCD staff who are reviewing housing elements. We have another spike for the Association of Bay Area Governments in 2023, but already those jurisdictions are beginning to prepare their housing elements. And we are certainly already providing them technical assistance. We expect to see drafts start coming in likely in the summer. So our workload kind of fluctuates in terms of housing element reviews, but for the Housing Accountability Unit, this is an ongoing enforcement effort every year, whether it's a housing element review period or not. Next slide. So the consequences for noncompliance. Again, if you have a noncompliant housing element, you're going to be ineligible for some state funds, and some of them are listed here. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but permanent local housing allocation, local housing trust fund, infill infrastructure grant, etc. All of these have a threshold of either housing element compliance to receive funding or to delay until you have compliance. There's also a consequence that you cannot use inconsistency with zoning and general plan standards to deny an affordable housing project. And in some cases, HCD can notify the Attorney General. If the Attorney General chooses to bring suit, fines can be imposed upon a jurisdiction for being out of compliance. So I think housing elements have been something historically jurisdictions and maybe even the public have thought to be an 8-year exercise. Do your housing element, do the hard work, roll up your sleeves, and once it's certified, just put it over there on the shelf, and in 8 years, we'll look again and see how well we did. And that is really a new paradigm that I like to communicate at every opportunity. We think of a housing element now as an 8-year contract. This is something that is certified, but we are expecting jurisdictions to make those commitments and work on implementing throughout the planning period. And the Housing Accountability Unit exists in part to really hold jurisdictions accountable to that commitment throughout the planning period. So a lot of what we've talked about so far has been in the sphere of our reactive enforcement or complaint-based work. Proactive enforcement is something relatively new for HCD. It's something that we can take on now that we have more staff and more capacity. So jurisdictions are committing to monitoring certain site inventory strategies. It's one of the things our housing element reviewers are doing really well, is requiring jurisdictions to create programs that set them up for monitoring. The Housing Accountability Unit will be on the other side of that, receiving that monitoring and tracking progress. As you might know, annual progress reports are due to HCD on April 1st of every year. In the past, there has been some data validation. We use those reports on an as-needed basis. So sometimes we're poking in to see what a city's RHNA progress has been. But we hope to become even more proactive than that in this year and the coming years. Annual progress reports not only provide numbers in terms of how many units have been permitted and perhaps how many units are in the pipeline, but they also provide quantitative or qualitative updates on progress made toward implementing housing programs in the housing element. And I think that is one key area that our unit will be able to use to start checking progress and measuring whether the progress that a jurisdiction is making is proportionate to where they're at in the planning cycle. And I think that's the end of my slides. David, back to you.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, just a few notes about collaboration with partners and stakeholders, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I know there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. Maybe I will ask for help from Jeanette to, maybe we can co-facilitate that. Actually, while I'm at it, I just want to note, we won't be able to answer every question. So we're probably going to focus on those that kind of are at medium and high level rather than getting into the sort of deep weeds of some of the work. There are 30 questions right now, so we do need to prioritize a bit. So real quick, you know, one of the big takeaways I hope folks will leave with it is this, that, you know, we have a great team of folks who are primarily working in Sacramento. With COVID and remote work, we do have folks in other parts of the state, but you and folks working in other regions are really those with their ears to the ground, their finger on the pulse of what is going on in the communities, what cities and counties are doing that are good, that are problematic and concerning, you know, what's going on with housing elements, what's going on with project approvals, new ordinances that are being passed or updated or amended. And we hope and know that this is already happening, that it really can be a partnership with HCD on sort of flagging those issues. So, for example, on housing elements, we hope that, well, we know many of you are engaging at the local level in helping to shape what the housing elements look like. Engaging in the public participation process, sending comments, going to hearings, going to community meetings. And we really want to encourage that so that when the housing element does get to us, it has the benefit of all of that input. And to also share your comments with HCD on those housing elements, because we do look at every comment that comes in, and that is incorporated into our review of each housing element. So that's on housing elements. Also, to please share complaints about potential violations of the various housing laws that Shannon summarized. If it has to do with housing elements, the email address is there. It's housingelements@hcd.ca.gov. If it's related to any of the other laws that we enforce, or if you're not sure what law it violates, you can send us a complaint at compliancereview@hcd.ca.gov. And those will get assigned out and investigated. Of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak to members, to come to conferences, to have discussions like this, so that we can share what we're doing and hear from folks about you know, what they would like to see and what they're seeing on the ground. So those are just a few ideas. We do want to encourage folks, when you are engaging, to send comments, for example, about housing elements early enough in the process. So, you know, to engage local jurisdictions on their public drafts before it gets to HCD, as I said before, and to engage HCD really in the first 30 days of our 60-day review. so that we can make sure that that gets incorporated into that review. We also encourage folks to be creative with your comments about sites, to remember to think about zoning and programs together. If a site is a good location but doesn't seem to have a good chance of development, what could the city do to improve the odds? Could it make it by right, reduce fees, add concessions? So, to really think creatively and about those issues. We really do want to hear about the barriers to housing production, especially affordable housing production. Obviously, that's where the greatest need is. And we want to make sure housing is getting built, especially housing that's meeting the needs of those who are struggling the most in our state. So those are, again, just a few ideas we wanted to throw out there. We are going to open it up to discussion. A few questions, if folks would like to keep in mind, we do want to hear from you. You can put your responses in the chat. I don't know if we're going to actually open it up for verbal discussion, but a few questions to have in mind. What questions do you have about our process, our strategy, our approach? What trends and patterns are you observing in your communities that would be helpful for HCD to know about? And what are your hopes for the accountability work in the HAU? What do you want to see from us? So those are just a few questions to keep in mind. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to try to look through the many questions in the Q&A. And Shannon and I will do our best to answer as many of these as possible. I don't know, Shannon, if you've already had a chance to start looking. I can start to take a look.
Yeah, it's a long list. We have a spirited group.
Clearly. I'm going to start with my friend Zella Knight's question. Big fan of Zella. What steps and strategies are prioritized in the effort to engage and inform stakeholders who are not familiar with HCD processes, et cetera? Well, we are going around to a lot of groups right now. It's a big priority to get the word out there. And Zella, I think my door is always open. So if folks have ideas about groups that it would be helpful for us to speak with, you can let me know and we can try to get something on the books. We definitely want to hear from folks who have lived experience and expertise, who are involved in their communities and know what's going on. We know we have a lot to learn from those communities. I just got off a call with someone in the disability rights community. Zella, you know her, and we're working with that community as well. So we're open and definitely want to get out there and do that education and do prep calls ahead of time to make sure we're meeting our audience where they're at. We don't have to do a stock presentation. If we need to back up and do a little bit more of a primer on some of these issues, we can probably do that. Shannon, feel free to jump in if you see a question that makes sense to answer right now.
I think I was starting to type some responses in the Q&A window, if that's okay.
That works. So I see a question. I'm kind of not totally arbitrarily going here, but looking at ones that I can answer quickly. From Sydney McCormick, where or whom are the majority of complaints coming from? I don't know if Shannon, you have an answer to this. I think it's a little hard to say. I mean, we get complaints from a variety of groups. I will say, and this is not a critique or praise, it's just a fact. I think we do hear from YIMBY groups a fair amount. I think they've done a really good job of organizing folks and getting folks out there being vocal about what's going on in their communities. And that's great. We do want to hear from folks in the pro-housing YIMBY community. We also want to hear from folks who are focused on deeply affordable housing, supportive housing, racial equity. I know many of the YIMBY groups are, but we want to make sure to be hearing from folks with those priorities as well. Legal services organizations who are tracking this stuff, we want to hear from. So I don't know, Shannon, if you have more data on kind of who we're hearing from.
Yeah, I'd say it's a fair mix. Frequent flyers definitely include project proponents directly, or their land use attorneys often contact us. But I would say equally, the advocacy community is also very engaged. It really depends on the issue. For project-based work, it tends to be people related to the project itself. I don't think that I mentioned, we are often asked questions of statutory interpretation that don't necessarily pertain to a project at all. And in those cases, we receive them pretty frequently from the advocacy community that is trying to, I think, test and see how well the laws are working. And I'll be really candid. I think that's some of the challenge of this work for the state, is trying to understand the boundaries of our authority. There are times when, and I'm going a little beyond the question here, but I think it's pertinent for this group based on some of the questions that I'm seeing in here, where there's a question for us if something smells a little bad, or if there's an actual violation of state law, or if there's a violation of state law over which HCD has authority. And I would say that's a really big theme of our work. And so when advocates reach out to us, I think a lot of times there's some amount of testing whether or not the bills that they have advocated for are working well. All of that is fine feedback for us to be receiving, either here in the chat or through our compliance review inbox. But again, I think, David, you talked at the beginning about kind of the way we can prioritize our responses. Projects that have units in balance, we're certainly prioritizing those cases. If there are city council meetings upcoming and we know that perhaps a letter that we send of technical assistance might sway a decision, that might be a case that we can prioritize. And cases where we're asked a statutory interpretation that doesn't have a discrete deadline, can take a little bit longer to respond to. So that responds a bit, of course, to who is sending the questions, but also a little bit to our ability to respond to those things in a timely way. And I think I was just going to mention, there's one more email address that I don't think made it into the slides for our ADU team. And I'm trying to look it up right now to make sure that I've got it right, because I'd hate to send you to the wrong place.
That's a good point. Yeah, we'll get it in there. So yeah, we also review, I think Shannon mentioned this, we review all ADU ordinances that are passed for compliance with state ADU law. And we also provide technical assistance on ADUs. Thanks, Annie. I think Annie shared it.
Great, thank you.
And great to hear that the AD team is super helpful. They are a great team. So if it pertains to an ADU ordinance or problems implementing ADU law, you can email that address there. I'm going to say it out loud for people who may not be able to read it. It's adu@hcd.ca.gov. I'm seeing a question. We're getting a lot of these questions right now about SB9, so I thought I'd take the chance to clarify something there. The question is from Ann Paulson. It says, are you monitoring SB9 ordinances? A lot of cities are putting in barriers to using SB9. For example, my own city, Los Altos, requires a CEQA-like historic resource determination, but I thought ministerial approvals couldn't require this kind of discretionary review. You may not love this answer. HCD actually does not have enforcement authority over SB9, at least not yet. That would require a legislative change. So we are not specifically monitoring SB9 ordinances. Now, there's a pretty important caveat to that, and you kind of identify it here, or actually, I think someone else might have asked about this. When jurisdictions are crafting ordinances in reaction to SB9, and for those who don't know, SB9 essentially allows lot splits and duplexes, and to some extent ADUs in single family zones. So and some jurisdictions are nervous about the impact this will have on the character of single family neighborhoods. So that some are passing ordinances to try to mitigate the impact of SB 9. It's important for jurisdictions to keep in mind that there are a number of other laws they need to make sure they're complying with when they pass these ordinances. An easy example is the Housing Crisis Act of 2019, which prohibits lowering the intensity of a land use designation to pre-2018 levels. Some people refer to the Housing Crisis Act as SB 330, which actually they're not quite interchangeable, but that may be how people know about it. So if an ordinance is reducing the intensity or the density allowed in a zone, it might be in violation of the Housing Crisis Act. It might be in violation of state ADU law if it's changing the rules around ADUs. And those are things we do have the authority to review and enforce and provide technical assistance on. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind. So feel free to share complaints about ordinances that jurisdictions are passing in reaction to SB 9, that if you think they may be implicating other laws. We have gotten a number of those complaints and we are looking at those. We also will be issuing some guidance around SB 9. It will not be detailed guidance, but we do want to answer some of the frequently asked questions and provide HCD's view on that. I hope that's a helpful answer for now. I'm sure it's not exactly the answer that people want. Let's see, I'm just going through here. So I'm seeing a question from John Bollinger. You mentioned 539 cities and counties and review of around 226 in 2021 and submission every 8 years. How many staff are required to handle this load, including review of elements and then monthly or yearly follow-up on compliance and investigation? How will you deal with reports of violations at a local level? Who are you prepared to partner with in tracking compliance or violation at local levels, public or private? Shannon, do you, I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you want to take a first crack at this or do you want me to?
Sure, I can take a crack at it. You might actually know better how many people are on the org chart. I'm going to answer it without giving you the actual number of staff because I just don't have it off the top of my head. But I will say we have housing element reviewers who are reviewing like 8 housing elements concurrently. The workload is really heavy and it feels like not enough folks are available to do the work and the enforcement at the same time. That being said, we are staffing up our enforcement team. They are different people. Going forward, we're going to be able to focus more on enforcement than housing element reviews. In terms of partnership, that's part of what the purpose of this meeting is and what the purpose of our kind of roadshow is to say, similarly to the way that we take third-party comments during our housing element review process, we absolutely can't know every site in California and its validity, and we rely on our partners on the ground to tell us when sites are bogus. You all are not shy about that, and I think it's wonderful. That's what we need. The accountability work is very similar. We will need partnership from people on the ground, informing us when they see things that are incongruent with the city or county's housing element or state law as they understand it. That being said, though, we do have a limited amount of resources and we will not likely be able to investigate every single complaint all the way through to Attorney General referral, right? And so some amount of prioritization will occur. I don't know if that's a helpful answer for you, David, or if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really helpful. I'll just say a couple things. So again, we have 2 units. I'll just explain the org chart real quick. We have 2 units that fall under me. Shannon is the unit chief for the Housing Accountability Unit, which when fully staffed up should have about 25 people. The other unit is the Planning Grants and Incentives. The unit chief there is Paul McDougall. When fully staffed up, it should also have about 25 people. We are hiring right now in both units. So we're not fully staffed up, but we're getting there. Housing element review falls into both units, more heavily weighted towards Paul's, but quite a bit falling under Shannon and our senior housing accountability manager, Melinda Coy, whom many of you may know, and is one of our housing element gurus for sure. You know, again, the housing element review falls into both, and it makes a lot of sense that it does, because it relates to technical assistance, relates to accountability. There's also simply staffing needs that you know are there. You know, I know that there are groups. I spoke with, I hope I can use his name, Cesar Covarrubias over at Kennedy Commission just the other day. I know the Kennedy Commission is putting together a really good tracking system for looking at the commitments that jurisdictions in Orange County are making in their housing elements in terms of the programs and policies they're committing to and the timeframes. That's very close to what we're working on. We always welcome partnership and information sharing to help with that tracking and monitoring. Obviously, advocate, you know, I come from the advocacy world. It's a hugely important role. Yeah, so certainly encourage that. Let's see. Development caps. I'm seeing a question there I think I can answer quickly from an anonymous attendee. Are development caps, especially those in high resource areas, legal? There's one in a very high resource area near me that's surprising that hasn't been questioned by HCD. It won't be questioned by HCD probably unless we get a complaint about it, because it's just hard for us to sort of know about everything that's out there. Again, 539 jurisdictions, more than a dozen different laws, lots of ordinances in every jurisdiction. So if you know about it, we encourage you to email us at that email address, compliancereview@hcd.ca.gov. Development caps, as I understand it, have to be approved by HCD and only under very limited conditions related to health and safety will HCD approve those. So pretty high bar and probably worth hearing about. Let's see.
One question in the chat is about, actually, I think I just lost it by typing an answer. There was a question about tracking, and I wanted to make sure that everybody has access to our open data tools, which I will post here in the chat. You have access as the public to all the annual progress report data that we receive. We know that the weakness in annual progress report data is that it is self-reported by jurisdictions. So certainly if you are somebody who knows there's something not factual in there, you can report it to us that way, but you can certainly see how cities are progressing through meeting their RHNA and other program commitments that they've made. I think there was also a question in here somewhere about our letters being posted, and it is true. Some of the letters are, will say like, contact us for a copy of this letter. I think it was 2020 and forward. All of the letters have been posted as just a matter of our process. Some of the older letters did not get posted. It's frankly because of the Americans with Disabilities Act requirements on state websites, and some of the way those old files were formatted, we were forced to take them down. And so it would require some remediation to get all of those documents back on our website, which is something we aspire to do, but it has not been prioritized ahead of answering actual cases. But certainly all of our letters are available. Some of them you would have to request by email. The spreadsheet that shows, if you haven't seen it, it's a spreadsheet that shows you in one column what jurisdiction was involved, and then the columns next to that give you a clue as to what the nature of the letter was about. In other words, what area of law was enforced or discussed. And that might help you if you're looking for examples of, say, density bonus. You can look for all of the density bonus law letters or correspondence and request those. So hopefully that helps somebody who's trying to navigate our website.
Thanks. I'm going to try to tackle a few here. Annie Fryman asked, what are the elements that make a complaint to your unit most helpful or constructive to the team? I'd like to ensure anything I submit is as immediately useful and actionable as possible. I'll take the first crack, but I hope Shannon will fill in any blanks here. The short answer is as much information as possible is what's helpful. So, as many of the facts and documents as you have access to, with enough lead time, if it's a really urgent issue, making sure that's clear, giving us the date of upcoming hearings that we need to be concerned about, city council hearing, planning commission hearing, etc. So, and any analysis you've already done about, potential legal violations, which laws are you seeing are implicated? We'll of course do our own analysis, but I think, giving us a heads up on that would be great. So yeah, we don't expect complainants to know the ins and outs of the laws. That's not your job, but to the extent that you have that information or any facts to support the claim, I think that's all helpful. I'm going to pause, see if Shannon wants to add anything.
Yeah, I think actually the lens that I use when looking at these complaints is to what extent does HCD have authority? And there are a lot of complaints that are problematic, I'll say, right? Frustrating at least, but not something that HCD has authority to enforce. So to the extent that you're submitting a complaint and you believe that there is specific HCD authority, it'd be wonderful to flag that. Even if your understanding of it is limited, of course, we don't expect you, again, to be experts, but if you believe that it's a specific part of density bonus law, say so. We'd really appreciate that breadcrumb. Understanding that we are a neutral third party. We are in the business of seeing housing get built, but we are certainly not going to take a developer complaint without vetting it against a city contact. So if you are emailing us about a particular project, contact information, even of who you've been working with at a city, is helpful if you're coming at it from that perspective. Really any way to set us up to kind of understand the history. A timeline would be really wonderful, but that doesn't always work out, especially if you're making claims about number of hearings or an excessive number of meetings. Some way to kind of bring us through the history of when the project received an application, when it was deemed complete, if it was deemed complete, how many hearings it's had, etc. Any kind of succinct way of presenting the project history and then connecting it to HCD's enforcement authority would be an ideal way to present a case. I realize that that's not always going to be possible, but that would be ideal.
Again, in no particular order, see a question from Ryan O'Connell. When HCD notifies a local agency about a potential violation, do you share information about who reported the issue? I've seen individuals named in correspondence with the cities and housing element notifications. I'm curious because I've also personally received upticks in hate mail and harassment after reporting violations. First of all, I'm very sorry to hear that. Obviously, don't want that happening. My understanding is that when somebody submits a complaint, it is now then subject to Public Records Act requests and is public information. So it's not anonymous in that regard. I don't know if Shannon knows if we're like proactively sharing that information with jurisdictions. I don't know that we would, but I do think that this is a place, I'll just sort of unsolicited idea or request here, but I do think that this is a place, one example where we see kind of some desire for anonymous complaints is among developers who want to maintain good relations with local jurisdictions. Totally understandable. So, hesitate at being on the record as complaining about something because they may rely on the local jurisdictions, obviously for approvals, but also for local funding, and want to maintain those good relationships. I guess I'm hopeful that groups like SCAMP and their counterparts in the other regions can kind of play a role here, so that rather than developers who may not feel situated to submit complaints directly, those developers can work with the advocacy groups to do some of that. Or as somebody said in the chat, to reach out to a local YIMBY group, for example, who can submit the complaint on behalf of an individual. I think that's another great resource. So that's just my initial thought. Certainly has come up before. Again, sorry that's happening, Ryan.
I'll also add, it limits our ability to intervene, but it is not uncommon for a developer or someone on their behalf to reach out and want to ask us questions or say, does this seem kind of fishy, and then limit us and say, please don't reach out to the city. We're not ready to have HCD calling the city about our project. That's possible. That is something that we can do, but it limits our ability, right? Because we are really only going to hear one perspective, which sometimes isn't the full perspective. And we're certainly not going to be issuing a technical assistance letter or anything, that escalates beyond that without speaking to the jurisdiction involved. But we do absolutely understand that calling the state to complain about a city in which you are doing work and have done work and intend to do work years into the future, could jeopardize your relationships at the local level. And so our staff is sensitive to that. It's one of the questions we ask is it all right for you if we contact the city? The problem is if the answer is no, we're probably not going to be able to go much further, but we can certainly hear you out. If that is helpful to folks, we're pretty sensitive about stopping when we're asked to stop.
Going back to some of the earlier questions, is HCD sufficiently resourced to proactively and rapidly strike down municipal codes that are in conflict with state law? Municipalities don't need legally sound rules if residents can't afford to challenge them in the courts. I think the operative words there are probably proactively and rapidly. Proactively, that would be amazing if we could sort of look at all the ordinances that are out there. We just don't have the resources to look at 539 jurisdictions and their municipal codes and do an assessment of everyone. So I know broken record here, but that's why we want folks to submit complaints. That is intended really as one of the biggest takeaways of this talk. So I guess it's okay if I'm a broken record on that. Rapidly, we are a bureaucracy. We're, and that's just the reality. We do have our systems in place to get to at least take an initial look at all the complaints, and if we need to prioritize. And we've talked about that a few times now, so I won't repeat that. I know we're getting close to time. Jeanette or Alan, feel free to jump in.
Can I actually take a quick one before we toss it back?
I was just going to say I'm happy to keep answering questions, but if we need to end, I hope our host will let us know. But yeah, go ahead, Shannon.
There's one, and this is a pretty frequently asked question and one that we're aware of. So there is a spreadsheet on our website, like I said, that has links to most of the letters except for the ones that are non-compliant. And there's a question in here about being able to filter that spreadsheet. I agree with you, it is not intuitive, but yes, you can unprotect the sheet. So you have to first enable editing, and then you right click on the tab. I'm embarrassed to even tell you that this is our process, but you have to right click on the tab and say unprotect. And once you do that, then it will behave like any Excel spreadsheet for you. You'll be able to filter by jurisdiction. You can sort by date. It's one of the projects we did not discuss in this call or in our kind of look ahead is the robust increase in our technology. We are working actively on trying to work with our IT team and the state IT team to make sure that we're procuring a case management system that is better than our shared inbox and our Excel spreadsheet, which are our current methods. So we are limited a bit in what we have on our website, but we're doing the best we can. I think what I'm hearing from this, though, is we should add some instructions to the spreadsheet. So we'll work on doing that to make it easier to navigate without catching me in a webinar to tell you about how to unprotect a sheet. But hopefully that reached enough folks on this call that spread the news to your friends.
I'm seeing I think an important question from Kevin Burke. What penalties exist in real life for cities that do not develop compliant housing elements? A law has been on the books for 30 years that says cities with non-compliant housing elements can't deny projects with 20% affordable component. However, no one's actually tested this law. You have the resources to test the law. What can be done? I think another important takeaway is that we have pretty clear marching orders from our bosses that to lean into accountability, to be brave and bold here. And there, Shannon summarized the consequences of housing element noncompliance, including ineligibility for funding resources, including the sort of builder's remedy that you reference here, and including potential litigation, fines, et cetera. And HCD is leaning into its enforcement. The HAU was created for that purpose. My position was created for that purpose. The AB 215 that granted us new authorities, including proactive housing element enforcement, AB 72 a few years ago that gave us a bunch of new authorities. These things are all coming together, and it's not an accident. At the same time, we also have the carrots, the pro-housing designation, the incentives programs. So it is a huge focus of the administration, as I understand it, to use all the tools in the toolbox, including enforcement. I didn't even mention the formation of the Housing Strike Force at the AG's office, which is also, ready to take, to bring cases on behalf of HCD, on behalf of itself, to enforce housing element law and all the other laws we've talked about. So that, obviously you have to wait and see, but that is the intention. And I feel confident about that. And it's one reason I'm so excited about working here. I think we're pretty much at time. I don't know if Shannon, you saw one more that you wanted to try to address. But I'm very sorry we were not able to answer at least 44 other questions. Maybe we'll have to have another one of these sessions.
David, I just wanted to ask about the slides. Are you okay with me sharing that out?
I'll share with you an updated PDF version, and then you can get that out.
Okay, there's been a couple questions about the recording, the chat log, and the Q&A. So I can send that all out to everyone along with the slides. Great.
I guess I just want to take another moment to thank not only SCAMP, but also the 242 people or more who attended today, and the very spirited set of questions and comments. Again, just sorry we couldn't get to every question. They're really good. We're open to having more of these discussions. SCAMP and its members are really important partners. Obviously, the region is significant and important. It's very timely right now with the housing element cycle, but also obviously the most populous area of the state with a lot of issues going on. So, we want to keep these conversations going. But in the meantime, thank you for at least giving us an initial cut at the work that we do and hearing from you. We're excited about the work and excited about the collaboration with you all.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Shannon.
You got it.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.